So my name is Nigel Kinnaird, and I'm here with Karen Arbuckle, my colleague, and we're directors of the Lough Neagh Development Trust, which we formed about 5 years ago with the sole purpose of acquiring the bed and soil of Lough Neagh for the benefit of the community.
There was a feeling that the lough was neglected, that we take a lot out of the lough, but we don't put very much back in. We use its water, we excavate the sand, fishing, all of that takes a lot out of the lough, but there's no real investment has been put back into it. And there's a real passion around the lough to develop it and to make it much more than what it currently is, because it could give so much more back to us if we invested a wee bit more effort and time into it.
I think it's important also to put the context of the lough and some of the history of the ownership, because the Shaftesbury estate acquired the bed and soil in the mid-17th century and have owned it since. And they have developed the lake in certain ways, particularly in terms of extraction of sand and aggregates, which has caused quite a lot of controversy, particularly in the last 5 to 10 years. And there's an opportunity for the first time to potentially engage with the Shaftesbury estate with a view to them disposing of the bed and soil to a community-led trust, which is a unique opportunity.
Absolutely, it's the community that's actually driving the project. It's without their passion and enthusiasm, there would be no project. The lough historically has been there long before any of us, but we want it to be there long after any of us. So this is an opportunity, it's a once in a lifetime opportunity to take it within our control and to have it there for future generations.
And I think it's also important, again, just in more recent history, there was a discussion table in about 2014 that the local assembly, the government, should acquire the bed and soil from the Shaftesbury estate. In other words, like a nationalisation. And that was with the view to then trying to put in a good management structure. That was taken on board by government, but was rejected. And in the report that was issued, it was very clear that whilst government rejected the principle of acquiring the lough, despite its strategic importance, there was an acceptance that there needed to be a management plan, that the various interests in the lough were not being managed for the future.
The biggest obstacle is there's no one department at government level that's responsible for it, and that's why there's a need for the management strategy. It kind of falls between a number of stools. So if you want to get anything done, you have to go to a number of departments and speak to a number of people, and it just gets passed around. So part of what we want to achieve is to get a central focus for the management and strategy of the lough, so that we don't have this problem and that someone takes ownership of it and gives it that very important focus. You know, it's a central part of Northern Ireland. We rely on it for our water. Apart from the tourism and also the jobs that it offers in terms of fishing and the sand. Without those things, we wouldn't have the building jobs and construction that comes from that. 40% of our water actually comes from Lough Neagh. So there are very important reasons why there should be one government department that we can go to try and make things better. We do have champions politically in terms of some of the parties, but in terms of actual government employees, civil servants, no, we don't. And that's because of the way the departments are structured. There's no one department that will take complete ownership in managing the lough. So whilst DERA is the main steer, there are also parts that would fall to the Department of the Economy and the Department of Infrastructure. So we would like to try and get some of those issues ironed out.
A further complicating factor is it's not just the Assembly which needs to take in the lead, is we have 4 different councils who march onto the shore, in the top and the bottom. It's 150 square miles of water. So we've got 4 different councils who all have their own agendas, their own policies around the shore, and none of those are joined up, which again is another example of the lack of coordination and management of the lough. It's been very difficult. There is a number of really good organisations around the shore, all doing some fantastic work, and probably the one having the most impact, particularly in the environmental side, is the Lough Neagh Partnership, and they are funded very loosely by the 4 councils. But they're a management organisation. They're not about ownership. They're not, as such, representing all the communities around the shore and all the various stakeholders. So they'll be a very important part of this journey. The reason we formed the trust came out of work we did in 2016 to identify the best way forward. The recommendations that we made were to form a trust for the purposes of acquiring the bed and soil, and that will then need a full management structure. DERA took the initiative and the lead in 2014 after the government had rejected this proposal to acquire the bed. The Earl of Shaftesbury made it known that he was willing to engage, and that was critical to DERA appointing Development Trust NI to undertake the initial study. And it was that study over 2015, 2016, which led to various recommendations to go forward to the next stage. Absolutely. So we had a series of public meetings, indeed one in this hall here, all around the shore. We engaged with all the lead community groups, and we had a really good take-up, and we got momentum. And one of the hardest things is once you get momentum is to keep that momentum going. So that led to a 3-day Future Search conference, which we hosted at Tombridge in 2016. And that was, we had 8 stakeholder groups represented for 3 days. So 64 people divided into 8 stakeholder groups representing community, environmentalists, sand and extraction, water, all the various stakeholders. And as we went through those 3 days, we very clearly saw that actually everyone was on the same page. We all had the same aspirations for the lough. Everyone was unhappy. Everyone was annoyed what was being pulled out and nothing was being put back in. And there was a very clear message came out of that Future Search that the next stage was to take the ownership of the bed and shore is actually a crucial part of getting the governance right for this lough. Because if everyone is bought into that governance and that ownership, then other things can develop and we can turn Lough Neagh into the asset that it is, whereas some people nearly see it as a liability, which is ludicrous.
And part of the problem as well was the downfall of Stormount. The conference had happened just at a period of time when it was fairly stable and we had ministers in post. And I think it must have been just about 8 months after that, the whole thing fell. And the money that we had been promised through DERA to continue the project didn't materialise. So we have been, I suppose, in a kind of limbo since then because we haven't had the funding. We're all volunteers on the board, and there's only so much a voluntary group can do. we need to keep the momentum going with the community, but that involves a lot of time and effort and people. And at the moment, because we don't have the funding, we're very restricted in the amount of communication that we can actually do. So now that Stormont is back up and running, we have to start nearly from the start again to make our case, because the money that had originally been promised, whilst it is maybe still sitting there in the ether somewhere, it's new ministers that are in post. They have different priorities. So we have to start the lobbying process again. So that has been somewhat frustrating for us. They are different parties from the ones that we originally started with. And the Lough is maybe not so high on their agenda as the previous party. So those things are sent to try you, but that hasn't stopped our enthusiasm, because we still believe in the aims and objectives of what we were initially tasked to do.
Yeah, I mean, it has been a much slower journey than we'd like, but that is the nature of acquiring an asset. And this is probably, in the scale of asset acquisitions, is one of the more complex that you can imagine. As I said earlier, there's no textbook on the wall you can pull down and read up, how do I buy the bed and shore of a loch of 150 square miles and bring in the community and all the stakeholders and form a management plan. So we know we're in for a long journey. We knew that when we started. The successes have been the 3-day conference in Toome confirmed what we suspected. There's a huge interest from the community and across all the stakeholders to do this. What we need is the wherewithal and support from government to enable, not to raise the capital funding, that's a separate exercise, but to give us the business case, the governance, and form an elected board representing all the communities around this shore. And then we can really get to business. And I think that's still there on offer, because the Lough is still here, the same issues are still here, and the same communities are still here. This is I go back, Shaftesbury have owned the bed since the mid-17th century, so this wasn't going to happen overnight. My biggest concern, or our biggest concern, is Shaftesbury are quite free to sell that bed and shore to a third party. And this is something we keep reminding ministers and government, that there's a golden opportunity here and a community who are really keen to take it to the next stage. Karen?
I think for me was seeing all those people at the conference. You had the water service there, sitting with fishermen, sitting with the sand extractors, people that generally wouldn't share the same room. And some of those people sit on opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of what their interest in the Lough is. So for those people actually to come together and sit in a room and be able to discuss even the way forward was a huge piece of work that in the end turned out really well. The first day people were sitting, sort of on their hands and didn't say too much. But as the event went on, people started to come out and say exactly how they felt. And it was done in a manner that was, I wouldn't say affable, but people respected others' viewpoints. And that was crucial. Because, there are those that are there, the environmentalists, there are those that are on the industrial, the job spectrum, there's those from the tourist side, and then there's those that are just simply residents and use it for social and leisure purposes. So to have all those different perspectives in the one room was a tremendous accolade, really. And in some sense, we have lost a little bit of what we achieved that day. And it's that sort of feeling and sense of oneness that we need to get back to. Get back to.
ultimately, there is going to be a consideration required by the Shaftesbury estate to dispose of the bed and soil, but that will happen over a period of time. At this stage, we haven't even really been able to do a full due diligence and reach a valuation, but that will be a number, and it will be millions. The question might then be, well, where will that money come from? That will be supplied from a business case which is sustainable. So we have to get our business case and our sustainability right before we get to the acquisition. Karen touched on our funding issues to date. The hardest funding for us to raise in this exercise is now for the due diligence, the governance, and forming this interim board and creating a full-time board. And that is the hardest piece of funding. And that's why we're looking to a lead from our assembly. And we don't think that's unreasonable, because what's required to do that is relatively small money. The capital will be raised elsewhere. We're not going to government saying this is a secret way of trying to nationalise the loch. There were lots of examples, particularly in Scotland, of acquisitions of significant landholdings, particularly down the west coast. 40% of the west coast of Scotland is now in community ownership. They have raised millions and millions and millions. And there's been some speculation that some have not progressed as well as they should. But my argument is that there's been no downside, because if you don't try, you will never know. We modelled part of our strategy here on South Uist, which was acquired by the community of about 3,000 people on the island, same land area as we have water area. And that was a phenomenal success. They've just gone from strength to strength. They had their teething problems at the start. They had all the stakeholders. They had conflicts, same way that we will have here. But over time, that settled. And once they'd actually got themselves agreed on the way forward, they were then able to bring in new investment. And I think that the piece which has always impressed me there is they brought on their own wind station in the north of the island, which has created an endowment fund for the island. That would never have happened under the old ownership structure, because there was no benefit. So all that generating of income comes back into that trust and is then circulated. Next step, sorry, yes. So the next step is, so we have an interim board, and we envisage the interim board would run for 18 months. We're not elected. So we are very anxious. Our first step is to get an election process democratically, identify the community, have elections, and have independent appointed trustees. That is number one. Secondly, we need to do a full due diligence of the asset, and we need to then develop our business plan from that. So there's three really big pieces of work, and there's a lot more, but those I think would be the key steps.
Yeah, well, the community is one of the critical pieces of work. Earl Shaftesbury has been very specific that he won't just sell to a number of very passionate people around the Lough Shore. In his view, this has to be the will of the people of Northern Ireland. So we have got to demonstrate that this is beneficial and it is wanted by the people of Northern Ireland. And it is, because it's not just about those fishermen, those sand extractors, the jet skiers. You know, there are other people that come into the province. You fly in over the loch. The Game of Thrones, all of that is all part of this huge picture. There's about 70 different pieces of industry and interest that feed into this. So it's from that point of view that we need to embrace the whole community. And that is a huge piece of work in itself. And the 6 people that we currently are, we're not going to do that on our own.
I think I said earlier, and there's no textbook you can take down and start reading. You have to. There are some good examples of asset transfer or acquisition by communities, but in this one, there's no specific. There's just so many moving parts. So it comes back to the 3 Ps: patience, perseverance, and prudence. And we've had to have a lot of that, and we'll need more. But as I said, Shaftesbury have owned it since the mid-17th century, and we've been at this 5 years. So we are on a journey, and it will probably take another 5 years before we get to the end. If we have the funding released from government that we think we will, I think we can see a lot of progress in the next 18 months, but we need that catalyst.
For me, it would be, is your idea unique? Is anybody else doing it? Is it sustainable? From that, then, you need people who are passionate and enthusiastic and are behind the idea and the project. And then from there, it takes a lot of effort and a lot of time, and you need to be prepared for very hard work. People think that you can just get money from different funds, different organisations, and that'll set you on your feet and on your road to your business. That, in reality, that doesn't work. It takes a lot of time and commitment, and things don't always work out the way you want to, but it's your own determination and strength of purpose that will carry you forward.
I think, and it's a very simple answer, I think it's doable. I really think it's doable, and I think that the situation of Lough Neagh merits something more inspirational than anyone has thought of before. And I think if you've been in the business of community ownership, and I've a background in DT&I, and when you get community ownership right, the impact that you have from the asset is phenomenal. And I think there's just bucket loads of potential for Lough Neagh as an asset. And at the moment, it's a withering asset, and we're seeing it as a liability. So it is doable, and that's what probably drives me more than anything else.
For me, it's a couple of reasons. I grew up in the North Antrim area of the Lough. I have known it all my life. I see it every day. Not everybody around the Lough can see it every day because it's not totally accessible to them. So I've been very fortunate over the years. And like Nigel, I think this is a very doable project. I've seen projects in other parts of the UK and in fact internationally where they have done a similar piece of work and totally transformed it for the benefit of the community. And at the end of the day, that is where I can see the most benefit, that we can get a far better return than what we currently are from the Lough.